The daughter of Vincent Price. This is one of her books. This is her biography on her father, and I think it is very well written, and it's also just a great insight into your entire family tree that is fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So my dad was not the first Vincent Price, he wasn't the second Vincent Price.
A lot of Vincents in your family.
Exactly, he was the third. And my great-grandfather, so my dad's grandfather, was Dr. Vincent Clarence Price, and he was a homeopathic doctor who, this was in the mid-1800s, who had a difficult time growing facial hair. And so he had a really hard time getting clients, because they didn't trust him. He looked like he had a baby face. Come on in, you won't get the way. And so he had a lot of time on his hands, and so his mother apparently was just a horrible cook. And the worst thing she made were these biscuits that were like leaden. And so he started experimenting. He invented baking powder. And then, like a lot of people in the 1800s, he went west to make his fortune. He ended up in Chicago. He literally knocked door to door at women's, on women's housewives' doors and talked them into, trying baking powder, and it took off. And he had this food empire, baking powder, first extracts of vanilla, breakfast cereals. He even dabbled in dog foods. And so his youngest son was also Vincent, has 7 kids. And he was at Yale when the stock market crashed in 1893, and so they pulled him out of Yale and put him to work in one of the businesses that was so deeply in the red that it didn't, get sort of go belly up, and because it already was, and it was a candy company, and he very smartly moved it to St. Louis in 1902, 2 years before the Olympics and the World's Fair. And so my dad was then the youngest kid, he also Vincent, and by the time he came along, it was a very, my grandfather was the head of the largest candy company in the United States, the head of the National Candy Makers Association, and a big civil, just benefactor in St. Louis, and benefactor of the arts. And so those are the 2 Vincents who came before my dad. And it's relevant because my dad, spoiler alert, ends up doing a lot with cooking in his lifetime. And so people are like, where did that come from? Well,
it was in the family tree already. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that Vincent, your father Vincent, of the many Vincents, he was born in St. Louis, so he's actually a Midwest guy, which I think might be surprising to a lot of Vincent Price fans, that he, with that voice of his, with that Shakespearean way of his, that he actually was this Midwest guy.
Yeah, and he saw himself as that. There's a couple of interviews where he says, I sound like anybody from Missouri. Like, no, you don't. You don't. You don't sound like anybody. I mean,
it's how we Midwesterners wish we sounded.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But he absolutely saw himself as a Midwestern. He loved being from the Midwest. And I remember one time I was in Chicago, this was maybe 20 years ago, and I was in a little indie movie theater standing in the lobby waiting for popcorn, and there was a whole line of, people, and I was with a friend of mine who was Greek, this features in the story, and so I'm standing in line in this indie movie theater looking around as you do when you're, in a city where you don't know anyone, and I realized, everyone looks like me. They're all blonde and tall and, and they're all super nice and chatting and checking in on each other. And I'm like, my people. I found my people, the Midwesterners. And so I came in and I sat down with my friend who I was traveling with. I was like, oh my God, look around. These are my people. These nice, tall, blonde, friendly people. Right. And
party stock.
Right. And so that night I was, we were going to go to Greek Town for dinner in Chicago. And so we get out of the cab, and there's 2 short, dark people coming toward each other, screaming at each other, clearly married, a husband and wife, screaming at each other. And my friend goes, my people.
And you mentioned before that your experience of the Midwest was you went back to St. Louis for the Vincentennial. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, my dad's 100th birthday, they called the Vincentennial. So, yeah.
And was that fun to experience that embracing? Did the town embrace
Oh my
you
gosh.
and your
And
father's
it always
legacy?
has. I've always felt when I go back to St. Louis, you know, like it's home. And I probably do something in St. Louis once or twice a year, at least once a year.
Oh, wow.
I just gave a talk there for the Missouri Women's something Society, and it was packed, you know, it was really interesting. But that one was at the, it was like a 2-week celebration. People came from all over the world. And that night, on his actual birthday, it was at the Missouri History Museum, and it was 400 people, standing room only. They let people sit in the aisles. It was amazing to see how many people love my dad. He's still very much a hometown boy in St. Louis.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And did you, is his home, his ancestral home, is it still around?
It is, yeah. It's part of Wash U now.
Okay.
So it's my grandparents built it in the 20s. My grandmother was very upwardly mobile, and so he lived in 2 houses, you know, and then they built the bigger house, and she specifically positioned it across from the architecture department at Wash U, because it was a very nice thing to look out on. And now it's actually owned by Wash U, and it's because it's really like right on the campus, and it's a place where visiting like scholars get to stay. But
awesome.
At the time of, I think it was at the time of the Bicentennial, or maybe just slightly later, somebody I knew the person who lived there, and they had very carefully renovated it, and I was really eager to see it, not so much for like the kitchen, because obviously that would have been updated, but because they gave my dad the garret, which was basically the attic. But my dad wanted to be an artist, and so they said, he was 13 when they moved there, you can have the garret and be an artist there. And so, you know, and it was a built-out attic where he could set up an easel and, you know, have his bedroom and paint. So they really, you know, my uncle, my dad's older brother, was forced to go into the family business, and he was the super talented jazz pianist, but he wasn't given the chance to do what he wanted to do because he was the older one. But my dad was so artistic and creative, and by that time they'd had, you know, 3 kids.
The youngest.
Yeah, and they're like, yeah. And so he really knew that he was fortunate to have been born when he was born, the youngest, and really supported in wanting to be a creative person.
Well, you mentioned art, his love of art, and I know a lot of people are introduced to your father in different ways, different points of their life. Maybe is why they might be an Edward Scissorhands fan, or maybe they're a Michael Jackson fan, or maybe they're more old school like some of us. And but there's this other side to him, because he is definitely a multi-talented person. And you mentioned art. He actually went to Yale and then studied in London for art. But his love for art started much younger, didn't it?
It started in St. Louis. The sister was closest to him in age, left behind this book, which was sort of great masterworks of art, and he just fell in love with that. And then he was walking by one of the 2 galleries in St. Louis in the 20s and saw this beautiful thing in the window, and he went in and asked the gallery owner what it was, and the man said, well, it's a first state Rembrandt etching. And my dad said, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. How much is it? The guy said $37.50. And I mean, I blessed that gallery owner who didn't laugh at this kid. I mean, I'm sure he knew my grandfather was good for it, you know, but he set up this payment plan. It took him 3 years, and at age 15, he saved enough money, and he owned his first piece of art, which was a Rembrandt, and that just changed his life. And the museum, you know, in St. Louis, they were doing more progressive things, and some of it was controversial, like they bought a Modigliani in the 20s, and, you know, that was controversial, but people, you know, people loved it or hated it, and my dad was so excited about that. So,
and he was a lifelong collector.
Yes.
So it seems like he always had that instinct for understanding what is good art.
Well, it's not so much
and
good.
a love for it,
it's
for
really
sure.
what he loved, and he studied it. He was, you know, a student of the arts, and it wasn't so much what the world says is good. It's what, you know, what drew him.
Right.
And interestingly enough, a couple of the biggest collectors in St. Louis, like one of them, he gave the biggest German Expressionism and pre-Columbian collection at the St. Louis Museum, and they were best friends growing up and classmates. So, you know, there were kids who were interested in the arts, but as a general rule, that made you kind of an outsider to be interested in the arts. So. Yeah.
And you know, he always seemed to have that love for visual arts. So when he left London, and you know, he went to stage first, correct?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back and just say, because it ties into where you grew up. So
I grew up in Taos, New Mexico, just FYI.
So my dad...
Very much an art colony.
Yeah. My dad was allowed as a kid to go play in Cahokia, which is the largest of the mound cultures, the Native American mound cultures along the Mississippi and along various rivers. Like they go all through the south and further north. And then he was sent to a summer camp when he was young in the Four Corners, and he stumbled across a Native American burial ground. And his name was in the paper. It was like this big deal. He knew it was a big deal. So he fell in love with Native American art very, very young as well. And then by the 1940s was really actively involved in the Native American arts community. And by the 1950s, he was on the Indian Arts and Crafts Board of the Department of the Interior. So, so that was a big deal. But so cut to, yes, he goes to study art history at the University of London, but he goes to the theater all the time, and one of his roommates dares him to try out for a play.
Oh, okay.
And that's how he kind of
that transition.
Crossed over. And the play was such a huge hit. He was named Male Newcomer of the Year in the British Theatre that year, and the Female Newcomer of the Year that same year, was Vivian Leigh. So, you know, they both did just fine for themselves. But an American producer came over to buy the play he was in as a vehicle for Helen Hayes, who was the first lady of the American theater. And she and my dad starred in like the biggest hit on Broadway, and that's what really turned him into a star at a very young age, 24.
Does he recall, or did he share whether she had good insight for him?
Oh,
because his career went from there.
Yeah, no, this was the Depression, and Universal Studios offered him $1 million movie contract, which in the middle of the Depression was a lot of money. And so he actually went to Miss Hayes and asked her advice. And she said, I just have one question for you, Vincent. Do you think you know your craft? And my dad, you know, he wanted to do a lot of plays. He never got cast, not in high school, not at Yale. And so he knew he didn't know what he was doing. He'd been in a play in London, and then Victoria Regina, and then this production. So he turned it down. He turned down the movie contract, and he actually ended up doing summer stock, because in those days Broadway closed because there was no air conditioning in the summers. So you do like 4 or 5 plays a summer with great actors and actresses, really great productions. So he did Victoria Regina, which was the play with Helen Hayes, for 2 years, and 2 summers of summer stock. And then he felt like he had 10 shows under his belt. And so he then went out to Hollywood and thought, I'm going to break into the movie business. But he was 6'4" and really handsome, and they wanted him to be a leading man or like a rom-com kind of star, and he didn't want to do that. So he kept going back to Broadway. Like, he worked with Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater. He kept doing things where he could really play roles of substance. And then in the early 1940s, he was cast in a play called Angel Street, which is still the longest running melodrama on Broadway. And that's the play that invented the term gaslight. So basically, he plays, this would become a theme in his career, a man who wants to get rid of his wife. And so he does it by trying to, make her think she's going mad. He gaslights her.
Right.
And 850 performances, and people, were booing and hissing, and so he realized, like, a 6'4", beautifully spoken, Yale-educated, smoking jacket, ascot wearing, handsome man could be a character actor as a Gothic villain, and so that was really the first big shift in his career.
And he did that role so well.
Yeah.
And he also started with some pretty big names when he was doing that. Before we got to the horror phase.
Yeah, oh yeah.
He got into that Gothic villain phase, and in some significant film noirs like Laura.
And
yes, a lot of these big costume productions like the Private Lives,
Right.
Lives of Essex and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So I think it's also interesting about that phase is he got to work with some really fascinating, beautiful leading ladies
Oh my
as well.
gosh, yeah. The one he worked the most with was Gene Tierney. So he was in Leave Her to Heaven, Dragonwyck, and Laura with Gene Tierney. Now Dragonwyck was a huge deal for him. He actually lost 60 pounds to audition for the part because he wanted that part so badly. And if you haven't seen it, it's like a precursor to all the Poe films. He's, you know, very handsome, very charming, and then you realize there's something off about this guy, you know. And again, with the trying to get rid of the wives theme, you know, but it's a fantastic film, and that was his biggest starring role but he did like Song of Bernadette.
Right.
He had a great part in Song of Bernadette, Laura obviously, and then a lot of the film noirs. He got to work with Ava Gardner.
Yeah, big names.
Yeah, big names.
Jane